Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? I didn't plan on staying in the city overnight, but after missing my last train, I had no choice. My phone had run out of battery, and I was stuck in the middle of a street in an unfamiliar neighborhood. I'd walked for what felt like miles, trying to find a place that would let me crash for the night. The area was quiet, almost too quiet for a city. The streetlights flickered dimly, casting long shadows on the sidewalks, and there was a strange stillness in the air. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hum of traffic, but that was it. It felt like the kind of place people usually just pass through. I had been walking for about half an hour when I noticed a small hotel tucked between two buildings. It wasn't like any hotel I had seen before. The exterior was old-fashioned, with a faded sign that read, **The Willowbrook*, Inc. The letters were weathered, as if the sign had been hanging there for decades, untouched by time. It stood out among the more modern buildings around it, and at first, I thought it might be closed or abandoned. But the lights were on inside, and there was a faint hum of activity. I approached the door cautiously, not really sure what I was getting myself into. I was exhausted, and my feet ached from walking around in circles, so I figured I might as well check in for the night and deal with figuring things out in the morning. When I stepped inside, I was greeted by an odd sense of warmth. The lobby was dimly lit, but there was a cozy feeling to the space-old wooden furniture. A few worn armchairs, and a small reception desk at the far end. The air smelled faintly, of wood polish, and something floral. It felt like stepping into a place that had been frozen in time, like I had walked into a hotel from a different era. The man at the front desk looked up as I approached. He was middle-aged, dressed in a dark suit, and had a serious expression, though his eyes were warm enough. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked politely. I nodded, a bit wary, but I was too tired to think much about it. I missed my train and need a place to stay for the night. "Do you have a room available?" The man paused for a moment, his fingers lightly tapping the wooden desk. "We have rooms, yes," he replied. "I'll need a name and ID, of course." I gave him my details, feeling the odd weight of the situation press on me as I handed over my driver's license. He glanced at it for a moment before nodding. "Of course, sir. We don't get many guests, so you'll have your choice of rooms. I'll assign you room 12, second floor." He handed me a key with a small, brass tag attached to it, and I thanked him before heading toward the stairs. As I ascended, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something strange about the place. Guns. The walls were lined with old photographs, black and white portraits of people I didn't recognize. Some of them dated from the early 1900s. The wallpaper in the hallways was faded, and the carpet felt threadbare under my feet. Everything looked like it belonged to another time, another world. Room 12 was at the end of the hall. The door opened with a creak, and I stepped inside. The room was smaller than I expected, but it was clean. The bed was made with pristine white sheets, and there was a small window that looked out onto a quiet, darkened street. The furniture was old but sturdy, and there was a small wooden wardrobe against the far wall. The light bulb overhead flickered for a moment before staying steady, casting the room in a soft, yellowish glow. I threw my bag on the bed and took a moment to sit down. I was tired, the kind of tired that made everything feel heavier, slower. The silence in the room was almost complete, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. I took a deep breath and turned to look around the room, but then something caught my attention. The room had a strange smell to it. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was an unfamiliar mix of old books, damp wood, and something faintly metallic. Ooh. I couldn't place it. I reached into my bag to charge my phone, but when I pulled it out, I realized something odd. The map on my phone didn't show any trace of the hotel. I searched for the hotel name, the Willowbrook Inn, but the results were empty. There was no listing for it anywhere, not even a nearby address. I brushed it off, telling myself the Wi-Fi must be weak in this area. Maybe I had gotten a spotty signal, which would explain the lack of data. But as I looked around the room, my discomfort only grew. It was almost as if the room itself was too still. There was something about it that felt too isolated, too disconnected from the outside world. The oddest part was the silence. There were no sounds of traffic from the street below, no distant city noises. The world felt distant from the hotel. I shook my head. "You're just tired," I told myself. I needed sleep. I changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed, pulling the blankets over me, the soft weight of them pulling me into a more comfortable position. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the feeling of unease that refused to leave. The pillows smelled like lavender, and I let my mind drift, slowly surrendering to sleep. But I was jolted awake a few hours later by the sound of a creaking floorboard. It came from somewhere outside the room, but it was so loud and distinct that it felt like it was right next to my bed. My heart began to race. The air in the room had grown colder, and I shivered as I pulled the blankets tighter around myself. The creaking continued, slow, deliberate steps across the hallway outside. Someone was walking up and down the hallway. I could hear the faint rustle of fabric brushing against the floor, the faintest whisper of footsteps. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to check, but I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just lie there in the dark, hoping it would stop. I threw the covers off and crept to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The hallway outside was dark, save for the faint glow of light coming from the stairwell. The hotel was eerily quiet now, but the steps, slow, deliberate, were still there. I stepped into the hallway, peering around the corner. There, standing at the end of the hall, near the stairs, was a figure. I couldn't see their face, but I could make out the shape of a person, standing perfectly still. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. I walked toward them, my heart pounding in my chest. My footsteps echoed loudly in the quiet hall as I approached. But when I was just a few feet away, the figure vanished. Just disappeared, as if it had never been there. I stood frozen, staring at the empty hallway, my breath catching in my throat. I turned quickly and rushed back to my room, locking the door behind me. My mind was spinning, my hands shaking. I couldn't think straight. The world outside felt too far away, and the hotel felt wrong. I tried to sleep, tried to convince myself that I had imagined it. But the sounds outside continued. The creaks, the footsteps, and the whispering voices. When I checked out the next morning, the front desk attendant asked if I had enjoyed my stay. I couldn't remember much from the night before, just that I had been awake, listening to the silence and the whispers. I mentioned the odd things I had heard, but the man at the desk just smiled, nodding like he had heard it all before. "I'm sure it's just the old building," he said, his tone casual. "Everything here creaks a little." I glanced back at the hotel as I stepped out into the street, but when I looked, I couldn't find it. There was no Willowbrook Inn on the corner where it had been. The building that stood in its place looked completely different, modern, sleek, with a new sign hanging above the door. I couldn't remember the street I had walked down to get there, and I couldn't remember how I had found that hotel in the first place. But I'll never forget the creaking floors, the whispers, and the feeling that the hotel had never really existed at all. Kide. I've worked at St. Mary's Hospital for over 3 years now, long enough to see the same faces, the same tired routines. The staff, the patients, the visitors, they all become part of the rhythm, the heartbeat of the place. You get used to it. The long hours, the stress, the smell of antiseptic that always seems to linger on your skin no matter how many showers you take. I'm an overnight nurse, one of the late shift workers, and most of the time, the hospital is relatively quiet, cool, during those hours. It's a time for calm and routine, for checking on patients who are asleep, making sure everything is in order. But there was something odd about the night shift a few weeks ago. I first met Jessica on one of those quiet shifts. She was one of the temporary staff, someone I hadn't worked with before. She was assigned to assist in the emergency room. I didn't think much of it at first, just another face in the sea of nurses, doctors, and technicians that passed through every day. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with soft features and dark brown hair that she kept pulled back into a ponytail. Her uniform was neat, professional, but there was something else about her that caught my attention, something that I couldn't quite place. She was always there, always at her station, moving around quietly, checking on patients, or speaking softly to doctors. But she seemed different from the others. She didn't talk much. She didn't joke around with the other nurses or make small talk. In fact, she didn't seem to interact much with anyone at all. She was isolated, in a way. But it wasn't until the third night I worked with her that I began to notice something more unsettling. I was working my usual rounds, checking on patients. When I passed by the staff room, Jessica was sitting inside, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring blankly at the wall. The fluorescent lights above buzzed quietly, but everything else in the room felt still, almost unnaturally so. She was the only one there. I didn't think anything of it at first. It was late, after all, and some of the staff had already left for the night. But as I walked past the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I turned back to look at her, and for a split second, I caught her eyes. There was a hollowness to them, like she wasn't quite there. Her expression didn't change. She didn't smile. She just stared. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I couldn't explain it. but I felt like I had just looked into something I shouldn't have seen. The feeling lingered with me throughout the night, but I tried to push it aside. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she was new and adjusting to the demands of the job. But the more I worked with her, the more I began to notice little things that didn't sit right with me. For one, she never seemed to leave the hospital, not even for a break. Whenever I would pass by the emergency room or the nurse's station, there she would be, always in the same place, always working. I could understand someone working long hours, but she never seemed to go home, and she never mentioned anything about a family or a life outside the hospital. The other nurses, the doctors, they all talked about their plans for the weekend, their kids, their hobbies. But Jessica never did. One night I pulled her aside in the break room, thinking maybe it was time to ask. Maybe she was just going through a rough patch, and I was reading too much into things. "Jessica, are you okay?" I asked softly. "You've been here a lot. Maybe you should take a break, go home for a while." She looked at me, but it was like she didn't really see me. Her gaze was distant, unfocused, and there was that same hollow look in her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, her voice soft, almost robotic. "I like being here. I'm needed here." I frowned, unsure of how to respond. I'd never heard someone speak so detached. It was like she wasn't truly present, like she was just going through the motions. But the thing that really unsettled me happened a few nights later. I had just finished my rounds in the ICU when I passed by the nurse's station again. This time, Jessica wasn't standing there, but I noticed the door to the staff-only hallway was ajar. I hadn't seen her go in, but I heard the faint sound of someone talking softly from inside. I paused, listening for a moment. The voice wasn't loud, just a quiet murmur, but it sounded like she was speaking to someone or something. Curious, I approached the door. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I felt compelled to peek inside. And there, standing in the dark hallway, was Jessica. But she wasn't alone. There was a figure standing in front of her. The man was tall, dressed in a hospital gown, his face pale and drawn. But what struck me most was that his eyes were completely black, hollow, like the kind of eyes you see in a nightmare. Jessica was speaking to him, her words barely audible. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but her voice was soothing, almost comforting. The man didn't move. He stood there, completely still, his gaze fixed on her. I stepped back, my heart pounding. What was I looking at? I didn't know what was happening. Why was she talking to this man in the middle of the night? And why did he look dead? I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just seen. I turned and walked back down the hall, my breath shallow, my stomach in knots. I had to get away from it. I had to get out, of there. The next day, I did some digging. I asked around about Jessica, about her background, anything I could find. But no one seemed to know much about her. There were no records of her having worked at any other hospitals. No family listed in her personnel file. No history, no background. It was as if she just appeared one day and was now working the night shift every night. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Maybe I was overworking myself. Maybe the hospital stress had finally gotten to me. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night, I made my way to the break room again, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, maybe ask her directly what was going on. But when I got there, Jessica wasn't sitting at the table like usual. The lights were dim, the room empty, except for one thing: a single patient chart lying on the counter. I picked it up. My hands were trembling as I read the name at the top of the chart. It was Jessica's name, but underneath, in bold red letters, was the date. Date of death, 2019. I dropped the chart, my heart racing. I turned, my feet moving on their own as I rushed down the hall. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get out of there, away from whatever this was. When I reached the nurse's station, I looked up. Jessica was there, standing perfectly still. Her eyes were empty, unfocused, her hands resting at her sides. She looked at me, her expression blank, but there was something in her gaze that sent a chill down my spine. Asterisk, you know, don't you? She said, her voice soft and hollow. I couldn't speak. My mind was spinning, my body frozen in place. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "I've been waiting." And for the first time, I realized she wasn't working the night shift. She was the patient. I've never been one to get involved in anything dangerous, or even slightly risky. I'm the kind of person who likes to keep to themselves, who values a routine, who's perfectly content with a quiet life. I know what I like, and I stick to it. But something happened to me recently, something I still can't quite explain, and it's been eating away at me. It started last Thursday night. The evening was normal. I had just finished a long day at work, a little exhausted, but nothing out of the ordinary. I decided to stay in for the night, watch a movie, eat some takeout. I didn't have any plans, and I wasn't in the mood to go out. It was raining lightly, the kind of rain that hits the windows just enough to be soothing. I remember the sounds of it as I curled up on the couch, the hum of the TV filling the silence, the weight of the blanket over me. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I remember setting an alarm, then closing my eyes, letting the exhaustion of the day pull me under. I fell asleep almost immediately, but when I woke up the next morning, it was like I had been ripped from a dream I couldn't remember, a foggy confusion clouding my mind. I sat up in bed, groggy and disoriented. My phone was on the nightstand, but when I reached for it, I saw something strange. My clothes from the night before were gone. I was still in the same pajamas I had put on. When I got home, my heart sank as I checked the clock on my phone. 10 a.m. I was late for work. But that wasn't the strange part. It wasn't the missing clothes or the fact that I'd overslept. It was that I had no memory of the night. I couldn't remember falling asleep, and I couldn't remember waking up. The last thing I could recall was getting comfortable on the couch, watching the rain fall outside, and then, nothing. It was like the entire night had been wiped from my memory. I rushed to get dressed and out the door, brushing off the strange feeling in my chest as just a result of a poor night's sleep. But the unease stayed with me. When I arrived at work, I found it hard to focus. My mind kept drifting back to the night. The more I tried to remember, the more distant it seemed, like it had been replaced with a thick fog. And then came the phone call. It was around noon when I saw the number pop up on my screen. I wasn't expecting any calls, so when I saw it was from a local police officer, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I answered quickly, my stomach tightening. "Mr. Carson?" the officer asked. "Yes, this is him," I replied, my voice shaky. "We need to speak with you about last night," the officer said, his tone flat, but serious. I felt a knot form in my throat. "Last night? What do you mean?" I was at home. I just watched a movie and went to bed." The officer didn't respond right away. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Can you account for your whereabouts between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. last night?" he asked, his voice now more cautious. I blinked. I was starting to panic. I don't know what you're talking about. I was home, sleeping." "You're certain about that?" he pressed. "Yes, I'm sure," I said, my voice shaking now. I wasn't sure why I was getting so upset. It wasn't like I had done anything wrong, but the fact that they were asking about a time frame I couldn't remember made my heart race. The officer's voice dropped lower. "We've found evidence that suggests you were somewhere else during that time. You're going to need to come down to the station to discuss this further." Before I could say anything more, the call ended. I stood frozen in place, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Evidence? What evidence? I hadn't left my apartment, hadn't done anything out of the ordinary. I didn't understand. Why were they asking about a time I couldn't even remember? The rest of the day was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything at work, the unease growing with each passing minute. What was going on? Why couldn't I remember the night? And why did the police think I was involved in something? What had I done? I went home that evening with a heavy heart, my thoughts racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had happened last night that I wasn't supposed to remember. The night passed without incident. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events of the day over and over in my head, but every time, done. I tried to think about last night. It was like my mind went blank. The more I tried to focus, the less I could recall. The next morning, I decided to go to the police station. I needed answers. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I couldn't live with the fear of not knowing what had happened. When I arrived, they took me to a small interrogation room, the same kind you see in movies. A single light hanging overhead. The walls were bare. I sat down, my palms sweaty, as they began asking me questions. "Where were you last night?" one of the officers asked. I repeated my story. "I was at home." "I don't know what you're talking about." The officer gave me a hard look. "We have footage of you leaving your apartment building at 10:15 p.m. last night. Can you explain that?" I stared at him. "What? No, that's not possible. I never left." "We also have security footage of you entering a convenience store at 11:30 p.m. You were seen on camera buying something, Mr. Carson." I felt the room spin. "What? I don't remember any of this. I was at home." The officer interrupted. "We've also found a set of keys in your possession. They don't belong to your apartment, Mr. Carson. Do you recognize them?" I shook my head, my mind reeling. I had no idea what was going on. The officer slid the keys across the table, and when I saw them, something inside me snapped. They were my keys. But they weren't just for my apartment. They were for a place I didn't recognize. "Where did you get these?" the officer asked. I didn't have an answer. And then, the most terrifying thought of all crossed my mind. The night I couldn't remember. What if I hadn't been alone? What if someone had been with me, guiding my actions, making me forget? The officer stood up, his voice cold as he walked toward the door. "We'll need you to come down to the station for further questioning." I stood up to follow him, my legs shaky, my mind racing. As I stepped into the hallway, I passed by a window that overlooked the street outside, and there, standing on the sidewalk, was me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was standing there, looking up at the station, and for a moment, I could have sworn it was me, but it wasn't. This version of me looked different. The face was mine, but the expression wasn't. He had the same eyes, the same posture, but there was something in the way he stood. Something off. Before I could react, he turned, disappearing into the crowd. I don't know what's happening. I don't know who that was, or what I did last night. But the longer I try to piece it all together, the more I realize I might never get the full picture. I think someone or something has been controlling my life without me knowing it. And I think the worst part is, I'm starting to wonder if I'll ever remember what happened at all. I've always liked staying in hotels. The anonymity, the quiet, the escape from the routine of my everyday life. It's always felt like a small adventure, even if I was only there for a night. This particular trip, however, wasn't meant to be anything special. Just a quick getaway to clear my head, a place to rest between work and family obligations. I booked a room at a small, old hotel in the middle of the city. Nothing fancy, just a quiet spot near the outskirts, away from the noise of downtown. The lobby was quiet when I checked in. It had that musty old smell to it, a scent of wood, death, and dust, and time. But there was something comforting about it. The clerk didn't say much, just handed me the room key with a polite smile. "Room 370, she said. "Upstairs. Third door on the left." The hallways were dimly lit, and the old carpet creaked beneath my feet as I made my way to the room. I opened the door to 37. The room felt exactly as I expected, modest but clean, with faded wallpaper and an old-fashioned bedspread, the kind of place you'd expect to find in an older hotel that hasn't been renovated in years. There was a small dresser, a window that overlooked an alleyway, and a desk with a chair. It was perfect for what I needed, a place to sleep for the night, nothing more. But when I went to unpack, I noticed something unusual. A piece of paper, folded neatly, tucked into the drawer of the nightstand. It didn't belong there, at least not in a way that felt normal. I pulled it out, confused. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and there was something about it that felt off, an unnatural weight to it. I unfolded it slowly, my eyes scanning the hastily scribbled words. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke, a prank left by the previous guest, but the words on the paper weren't funny. They were chilling. The letter read, *, "You are not safe here, do not trust them. They are watching you. Truth. You will find the truth when the sun sets." but only if you survive the night. I made a mistake staying here. You must leave, but if you don't, I hope you're strong enough to handle what comes next. The blood is on their hands, and soon, it will be on yours too. They can't help you. They never could. They'll come for you when you least expect it. Leave, now, while you still can. The handwriting was frantic, rushed. The ink seemed smudged in places, as though it had been Quentin, written under pressure. I stared at the letter for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Asterisk, who left this here? Why was it hidden in the drawer? It didn't make sense. No one had mentioned anything about danger when I checked in. The hotel felt normal, despite its age. No one had acted strange. I almost laughed it off. But something about the letter made me feel uneasy, a tightness in my chest I couldn't ignore. And then, my gaze fell on the bottom of the letter. It was stained. At first, I thought it was just a spill, maybe some old coffee or ink that had bled onto the paper. But when I looked closer, I saw that it was blood. Dark red, smeared across the corner of the page, still fresh, almost as if the paper had been folded hastily to hide it. My stomach churned. My hands were shaking as I put the letter back into the drawer. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had begun to settle in my chest. It felt ridiculous to be this paranoid. There was nothing to fear, right? It was just an old hotel, just some strange letter. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to check the room again, hoping to ease my nerves. I went over every corner, every shadow in the room, looking for anything out of place. But there was nothing. Just the bed, the desk, the bathroom, all perfectly normal. Everything, state, was exactly as it had been when I first entered. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air felt heavier, as if it had thickened with the weight of something unseen. The darkness outside the window seemed more oppressive now, the alleyway beneath lit by a single flickering streetlight. I kept glancing at the clock, my eyes darting back to the letter in the drawer. I couldn't bring myself to leave. My mind was racing, trapped in a loop of questions, doubts, and unease. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room. That's when the noises started. It was faint at first, just a soft thudding sound, like something heavy falling in the hallway. Then it was a scraping, like nails dragging across metal, or someone shuffling their feet slowly along the floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My first instinct was to look through the peephole to see what was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The sounds were getting closer. I could feel the pulse of fear pounding in my ears. And then, the door rattled. It wasn't a soft rattle. It was forceful, like someone had shoved against it. Tuss! I jumped back, my heart racing, my legs stiff with fear. The hotel room felt like a prison, the walls closing in around me. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I could feel the weight of the letter's warning pressing down on me. Asterisk, they are watching you. Put. There was no one outside the door, no one in the hallway. The building was silent, too silent. I waited for what felt like hours. Every tiny sound seemed amplified in the stillness. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next morning, tut. I checked out of the hotel as quickly as I could, my nerves frayed, my head spinning. I didn't want to look back. I just wanted to leave. As I walked out the front door, I glanced up at the hotel's old sign. It had a faded, peeling logo that barely read Willowbrook Inn, the same one I'd seen the night before, state. But as I stood on the sidewalk, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the glass door, something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing in the window. I turned, heart racing, but when I looked back, the window was empty. I've been home for a week now, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. That whatever is connected to that letter, to that hotel, is still following me. I've tried to forget, tried to go on with my life, but the memory of the blood-stained letter, of the noises in the dark, haunts me. And every time I close my eyes, I see that figure in the window, standing still, waiting for me to return. I don't think I ever truly left. I had been working at Cedar Hill Psychiatric Ward for almost 6 months when I first noticed her. At first, I thought she was just another patienta routine case. Someone who'd checked in, then faded into the background of our daily responsibilities. She was one of the long-term residents in Room 9, an unremarkable room on the second floor that wasn't considered a high-risk or acute room, but one we kept an eye on nonetheless. Her name was Clara, and she was in her mid-30s, quiet, pale, always sitting with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were often incoherent, like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. She had been there for years, part of the ward's haunting quiet undercurrent, the patients who seemed forgotten, those who were no longer on the road to recovery but simply existed in the periphery. I don't know why I noticed her that night. It was just another evening shift, late, past midnight, when most of the other patients were either asleep or in the common room, watching the low-budget TV shows they always watched. But I was on my rounds, checking rooms, making sure the doors were locked, the patients were settled. When I passed by Room 9, I saw her again, Clara. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, just staring into the darkness. There was something different this time, something about her posture, the way she was still, the emptiness in the room. It felt like she was waiting for something, or someone. But it wasn't the kind of waiting that made you feel like it was a positive expectation. It felt like she was waiting for an inevitability, something that she had no control over. I stood outside the door for a moment, watching her. And then, I did something I almost never did. I opened the door quietly. Clara. I called softly. She didn't react right away. It was as if the sound of my voice hadn't even registered. Then, after a long pause, she slowly turned her head toward me, her eyes wide, as if she had just noticed I was there. Yes, she asked, her voice distant, thin, barely audible. Are you okay? Do you need anything? She blinked, her gaze drifting away from me, back toward the window. He's coming, she whispered. I didn't understand. Who? She didn't answer. Her gaze seemed fixed on something outside the window, beyond the walls of the room. I stood there for a few moments, unsure of what to do. I wanted to offer comfort, but Clara wasn't the type of patient who welcomed it. She had always been closed off, unreachable, in a way that made you feel like you were walking through a fog when you tried to interact with her. Koku. I decided to leave her be for the night. Okay, Clara. Just let me know if you need anything. I left the room, but the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her statement, something she wasn't saying. That night, I made my rounds again, but I couldn't stop thinking about Clara. Why had she said he's coming? Who was she waiting for? And why did it feel so ominous? The next night, I walked past room 9 again, and as I neared the door, I noticed the same thing. Clara was sitting in the same position as the night before. There was that same stillness, that same eerie quiet hanging in the air. My heart skipped a beat when I realized that she was waiting again. And this time, I was determined to find out what was going on. I knocked softly before opening the door, calling her name. Clara. She didn't respond immediately, but after a few moments, she turned her head slowly to face me. Her expression was different this time. Her eyes were wider, more frantic, like she was on the edge of something she couldn't control. He's here, she whispered, so quietly I barely caught the words. What? Who is here, Clara? I asked, stepping closer to her bed. I felt a cold chill running down my spine. It wasn't like her to be this anxious, this aware. She looked at me with that vacant, unsettling stare, then muttered something I couldn't understand. Her words didn't make sense, strung together, gumble of incoherence. But I could feel the urgency in her voice. I can't leave, she said suddenly, her hands clutching the bedspread. I can't leave this room. He won't let me, Tay. At that moment, I felt a strange pressure in the room, like the air had shifted. My heart was racing. I didn't know what she meant. It was as if the whole space had darkened around me, as if something unseen had just entered the room. I stood there, unsure of how to respond, when the lights flickered. It was only for a second, but it was enough to make me feel like something was wrong. My skin prickled, a rush of cold sweeping through the room. I turned to leave, thinking I needed to get some help, but before I could open the door, Clara spoke again. He's here, now. You have to leave. I didn't understand. I glanced back at her, but she was no longer sitting on the bed. She had stood up, her movements slow, deliberate. Her face was still, but her eyes were locked on something I couldn't see. She didn't seem to notice me anymore, didn't seem to acknowledge my presence. I was about to leave when I heard it, the softest sound, like something scraping against the floor behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. Clara, I asked, my voice shaking now. What are you? The door slammed shut behind me, cutting off my words. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was empty. The only sound was the distant hum of the fluorescent lights above. My breath caught in my throat as I rushed to open the door to room 9, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked. I knocked, pounding on the door. Clara, open the door. There was no answer. The silence in the hallway seemed to stretch out, suffocating me. I went to get help, but when I returned with the key, the door swung open easily. I rushed inside, but the room was empty. Cat. There was no sign of Clara. No one had been there for hours. I searched the entire building. I asked every nurse and staff member if they had seen her. No one had. That night, I stayed up in the nurse's station, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had to keep my eye on the security monitors. I had to know where she had gone. Around 3 a.m., the cameras caught something. The footage was blurry, but I could make out a figure. It was Clara, standing in the middle of the hallway near room 9. Her back was to the camera, but her head was turned toward the wall, her eyes wide open, unblinking. And just as I was about to call for help, the camera feed cut out. The screen went black. The next day, when I returned to the ward, I noticed something strange. Clara's room was empty. The bed had been stripped, the room cleaned and prepared for a new patient. No one remembered Clara. No one even remembered her name. I keep coming back to it, to the way she said, "He won't let me leave." I'm starting to wonder if she ever left at all. And I wonder if the thing she was waiting for is still here, waiting for me. I still don't know how it happened. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday. The kind of lazy day where I would stay in, order takeout, and binge watch a new series. The city outside my window was peaceful. The hum of distant traffic, and the occasional siren breaking through the calm. The apartment was perfect for me, small, cozy, with just enough room to stretch out. It had become my sanctuary, a place I could retreat to after long, grueling work weeks. I woke up late, around 11 a.m., still groggy from the night before. I'd stayed up too late watching an old thriller I'd found on a streaming service. My head felt foggy, but I figured I'd shake it off after a shower. I stepped out of the bathroom, towel around my waist, and reached for my phone to check the time. That's when I saw the message, Kate. It was from my neighbor, Carla. She lived next door and always sent me the occasional text when something weird happened in the building. She was a nice enough person, friendly in that, I live alone and need someone to talk to kind of way. The message was short, but the words made my stomach drop. Are you okay? The police are outside. There's crime scene tape around your apartment. I stared at the screen, my brain struggling to process what I was reading. Crime scene tape around my apartment. It took me a moment to even register that Carla was talking about my place. I checked the clock again. It was barely noon. My head was spinning, and I didn't know if I was still half asleep or if something truly bizarre was happening. I quickly texted her back. What do you mean? I just woke up. I couldn't even hear anything outside. I lived in a relatively quiet building. No sirens, no police cars. I could see through the window that everything seemed normal outside, nothing unusual. Her response was swift. I don't know. There are cops everywhere. You should check it out. My heart began to pound in my chest. What the hell was going on? I rushed to throw on some clothes, my thoughts a jumble of confusion and panic. My head was still foggy, but I couldn't ignore the sense of urgency creeping in. I needed to know what had happened. When I opened my front door, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint, but it was there. Something metallic, something I couldn't quite place. My hand trembled as I locked the door behind me and walked down the hallway toward the stairs. The building was eerily quiet. I could see the yellow crime scene tape from the stairwell wrapping around the entry to my apartment. It was thick, stretching across the door like some kind of boundary I wasn't supposed to cross. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I descended the stairs. By the time I reached the ground floor, the hallway was full of officers in uniform, some talking in hushed tones, others peering at a clipboard or at photographs. They didn't seem to notice me at first, and I stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, watching them as they moved around. Then I heard a voice. "Is everything okay?" I turned and saw Carla standing just behind me, her face pale, her eyes wide. "I don't know," I replied. "I'm trying to figure it out." I followed her toward the door, the tape, and the officers. The lead detective looked at me as I approached. His gaze was sharp, calculating. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice flat. He didn't seem surprised to see me, but something in his eyes told me that he knew more than I did. I live here," I stammered. "What's going on? What happened, Toe?" He stared at me for a moment, sizing me up. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and gestured for me to look. My pulse quickened. I felt the ground beneath me shift. The door to my apartment was open. I stepped past the detective, barely registering his voice calling after me, and walked into the room that was supposed to be my sanctuary. But the sight that greeted me was anything but peaceful. The apartment was in chaos. Furniture was overturned, the couch cushions were ripped open, and there were streaks of something dark on the floor, smeared across the hardwood like a trail. My kitchen was in disarray, drawers, half-open utensils, scattered around as if someone had rifled through them in a hurry. But it was the walls that made my stomach turn. The blood, dark and smeared, was splattered across the living room walls. A jagged, chaotic pattern that seemed to have no rhyme or reason. I felt lightheaded, my hands shaking as I stepped forward, my eyes darting around the room. I couldn't breathe. I had no idea what had happened here. This is my place, right?" I whispered, the words barely coming out. I couldn't focus. The detective didn't answer right away. He simply motioned for me to sit down on a chair by the door. "We're still processing the scene, but we need you to come with us. We have some questions," he said, his voice unyielding. "Kath." His words didn't make sense. What could I possibly tell him? I had just woken up. I had no idea what was happening. What happened? What's all this? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's talk outside," he said. "Kush." I barely registered what was happening around me as they led me down the hallway to the lobby. I kept looking back, still trying to process the sight I had just witnessed. It didn't feel real. I couldn't have imagined it. As I sat in the small interrogation room, the questions started coming quick, sharp, one after another. But there was one question that stood out among them all. "Where were you last night?" the officer asked, his eyes fixed on me. I stared at him, my mind struggling to piece together the night. My memories were foggy, almost blank. I was at home," I said, my voice cracking. "I fell asleep early. I don't remember anything strange." The officer's gaze never wavered. He pushed the papers in front of me. "Can you explain this?" The picture he showed me was taken from inside the apartment. A grainy, blurry shot of someone who looked like me, standing in the middle of my apartment, blood-stained, a jagged expression on my face, holding something I couldn't quite make out in my hand. I stopped, my throat tight. That's not me. It can't be. I don't remember any of this. The officer's face was unreadable. But it is you. The security footage matches. You were seen coming into the building last night at 10:30 p.m. But after that, there's nothing. Just you in the apartment, walking around, pacing. And then well, we'll need to ask you about the blood. I felt my world tilt. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then the most chilling thought crept into my mind. What if I wasn't me that night? What if someone had been in my apartment instead, wearing my face, living my life for me? I don't know why I stayed late that night. The precinct was quiet, almost eerily so. Everyone else had left hours ago. The offices empty, save for a few officers finishing paperwork. I had always preferred working alone in the late hours. It gave me space to think, to go through case files without the distractions of the day. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights above, buzzing faintly, and the low murmur of the air conditioning struggling to keep the building cool. It was nearing 2 a.m. when I finished the last report. I stretched and stood up from my desk, feeling the weight of fatigue creeping into my bones. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, coming from the far end of the precinct near the evidence locker. It was almost imperceptible at first. A whisper, a rustling sound, cute. It was the kind of noise that could easily be mistaken for something else, whined, maybe, or the settling of an old building. But as I sat there, frozen in place, I heard it again. Clearer this time, a voice. My first thought was that I was hearing things. But the voice, faint, like it was coming from far away, like it was trying to reach me through the thick walls, was unmistakable. Help me. I didn't move. The air seemed to grow colder, the silence thicker. It felt wrong, hearing a voice like that at this hour, in a place as sterile and clinical as the precinct. It was the kind of voice you only hear in horror movies, the kind that sends a chill straight to your bones. I couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was faint, but it was real. There was no mistaking it now. It was coming from inside the evidence locker room. I walked down the narrow hallway toward the back of the building, the only light, the flickering overhead. The lockers were locked tight, each one containing pieces of the city's worst crimes, evidence from cases long forgotten or closed. Some of the items had been sitting there for years, abandoned, forgotten, untouched. Some had been sealed away for preservation, others waiting for trial. But none of them should have made any sound. None of them should have been calling out to me. The door to the evidence locker was securely locked, as always, a steel door, reinforced with a heavy-duty lock that no one had ever managed to break, without proper authorization. I stood there, staring at it for a long moment. My hand was already reaching for the keyring on my belt, but some instinct, held me back. I stood there for a few more seconds, listening. The voice had stopped, but the air still felt thick, pressing in on me, kind of silence that made every breath seem louder, every step heavier. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It was absurd. There was no reason for anyone to be in there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was out of place. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked as I opened it. The room inside was cold, darker than the rest of the precinct. The steel shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes, bags, and evidence crates, each one labeled with a case number, a date, and the names of the victims. The air was musty, and the faint scent of old paper and dust lingered in the corners. There was nothing unusual about the room at first glance, but then I heard it again. A low, strained whisper, louder this time. "Help me." The sound was coming from one of the metal storage lockers at the far end of the room. It was an older locker, one that hadn't been touched in a long time. Case. I recognized the number on the side case, 731, the missing girl. It was a cold case, the kind you try not to think about. The case had never been solved, and the girl, her name was Lily, had been missing for years. Her disappearance was one of those unsolved mysteries that haunted the precinct. It was a case that haunted me too. I had seen the photographs, the reports, the evidence. The girl had vanished without a trace, her name lost in a pile of unprocessed cases. The locker had been sealed for years. It was one of the last things I'd gone through when I first started working at the precinct. We never found anything in there. Just a few scattered personal items that made no sense. A stuffed animal, a photo album, a small silver bracelet. Nothing that could explain her disappearance. And yet, tonight, I could hear her. I felt drawn to the locker, my heart thundering in my chest. The whisper had grown more frantic, more desperate. "Please, I'm still here." I approached the locker cautiously, the metal floor cold beneath my feet. I reached out with trembling hands, and I swear to God, I felt a cold wind brush against my skin as I touched the door. It was a strange sensation, like the room itself was alive, breathing with something unseen. I could feel the temperature drop. The air felt damp, like something was watching me, waiting for me to open it. I didn't know why I hesitated. Maybe it was the fear. Maybe it was the eerie voice that echoed in my ears. Or maybe it was the sense of something ancient and forgotten reaching out to me. But I took a deep breath and pulled open the locker. Inside was nothing but an old cardboard box. I didn't recognize it at first, but when I lifted the lid, my blood ran cold. It was a doll. A small, porcelain doll, its face cracked and dirty. The eyes were wide, staring at me, empty and hollow. The doll looked impossibly old, like it had been sitting in the locker for decades. The clothing was torn and faded, the skin of the doll cracked and chipped. But it wasn't just the doll that made my heart stop. It was what was inside the box with it, a note. I took it carefully, my fingers shaking as I unfolded the brittle paper. The handwriting was faint, smudged, in places, but I could make out the words, asterisk, "I'm still waiting. You promised you'd find me." My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. How could this note be in this locker, from a case that had been closed for years? I knew I hadn't seen it before. I had gone through everything when I first started. There was no way this had been missed. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence in the room pressing in around me. I looked back at the doll, the way it stared at me, its broken eyes, never blinking, seemed too deliberate. too real. I closed the locker quickly and backed away from the shelves. The temperature had dropped even further now, the air thick with something I couldn't explain. And then I heard it again. A soft whisper, like a breath in the dark. Help me. But this time, it wasn't coming from the locker. It was coming from behind me. I was staying in a hotel downtown for a work trip, the kind of place where the building is old enough to have character, but not old enough to be considered charming. It had a bit of wear and tear, peeling wallpaper here, faded carpets there, but it was perfectly fine for a short stay. The lobby was grand with its marble floors and brass fixtures, though, and the staff were friendly enough. I'd been traveling all day and was exhausted, so I had no intention of going out once I checked in. I ordered some room service, watched a bit of TV, and called it a night. The hotel room was a bit cold, but nothing a few extra blankets couldn't fix. Ty was trying to unwind, scrolling through my phone when I noticed something odd in the room guidebook. It mentioned something about the building's elevator system. Asterisk, the elevator only operates to the basement at 3 a.m. Use at your discretion. Asterisk, it was a strange note, especially for a hotel. Why would an elevator only go to the basement at a specific time? Why would they even mention it in the guide? I laughed it off, figuring it was some weird quirk of the building, but the words lingered in my mind. I fell asleep around midnight, the sounds of the city muffled by the heavy curtains. I woke up a few hours later, around 2:45 a.m. I'd been restless, my sleep disturbed by strange dreams I couldn't quite remember. The room was still cold, and I was tangled in the sheets. I tried to roll over and go back to sleep, but the hotel bed felt too stiff, too uncomfortable. I got up to use the bathroom, and as I did, I glanced toward the elevator. The small light above it was glowing faintly in the hallway, but no sounds of movement came from it. I could hear the hum of the building, the soft creak of the walls shifting, but that was it. It was only when I got back into bed that I heard something strange. A soft, distant sound, almost like someone calling out. The sound was too faint to make out any words, but it had an odd urgency to it, like it was being carried through the building by the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then, it happened again. The sound was louder, this time, clearer. I couldn't make sense of it, but it seemed to come from somewhere deep in the hotel. Maybe from the stairwell, or somewhere farther down the hallway. It was a whisper, a call, but nothing like the usual sounds of the building. No doors opening, no footsteps. It made me feel uneasy, but the oddest part was that I was now awake and wide-eyed, listening to the strange sounds echoing through the hotel. I glanced at the clock, 2:58 a.m. The voice sounded like it was getting closer. Then, as if on cue, the elevator dinged. I froze. I hadn't heard it move, but I saw the light on the elevator flicker. The doors opened with a soft whir. It was still dark in the hallway, but the elevator stood there, waiting. I didn't know why, but something about it felt wrong. Wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The voice, the elevator, the timing. It felt as though they were somehow connected. Without thinking, I grabbed the hotel guidebook from the nightstand, flipping through the pages, searching for the odd note I'd read earlier. My fingers fumbled with the paper as I found the paragraph about the elevator. Asterisk, the elevator only goes to the basement at 3 a.m. Use at your discretion. I looked at the clock. It was 2:59 a.m. I couldn't resist. I had to know what was down there, what this elevator was all about. I wasn't even sure why it mattered, but a strange curiosity tugged at me, something I couldn't explain. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the elevator. It sat there, its doors open, waiting. I felt a cold draft coming from inside. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I stood there, frozen in the hallway. For a moment, I hesitated. I glanced down at my phone, the time ticking closer to 3 a.m. When the clock struck 3, the elevator made a soft ding, and the doors closed. I stepped back, confused. I hadn't pressed any button. Had the elevator moved on its own? I thought about turning around, heading back to my room, but I couldn't. I was too intrigued, too unsettled by the strange occurrence. I stepped forward, pressed the button to call the elevator, and waited. The doors opened once again, and the cold air rushed out. It was so cold, it sent a shiver down my spine. But something was different this time. As I stepped inside, I could see that the buttons for the other floors were dimly lit, except for one basement. The button was brightly lit, glowing in a way the others didn't. I didn't want to press it. I knew I shouldn't, but something drew me in, like a pull I couldn't resist. I pressed the button for the basement. The doors slid shut, and the elevator descended with a soft whoosh. The floor seemed to drop farther than I expected. I glanced at the numbers above the door. 10th floor, 9th, 8th. It continued, but the sound of the elevator moving felt odd, like it was traveling further than any normal elevator should. The number finally stopped at B4 basement. The doors opened. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. The basement wasn't what I thought it would be. It wasn't some forgotten storage space or maintenance room. Instead, it was a hallway, long and narrow, with walls that were bare except for the occasional flickering light. The air was damp, heavy, the kind of cold that made you feel like something was wrong. I stepped out, hesitant, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The hallway stretched in both directions, but the far end of it seemed darker than it should have been, like it was absorbing the light. I couldn't see the end, only darkness. I walked down the hall, the air growing colder. With every step, my heart thudding in my chest. Duh. I stopped when I reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was cracked open, just slightly, but there was light spilling from the gap. It wasn't warm light. It was harsh and sterile, like an operating room light. I slowly pushed the door open, holding my breath, and then I saw it. In the middle of the room was an old, rusted chair, sitting alone in the center of the room. Strapped to it was a figure, their face obscured by shadows. A low guttural sound came from the figure, soft, like a groan, but not of pain. It was something else. Something hollow. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The sound from the figure echoed in my mind, vibrating through the air, becoming louder, more insistent. The whispers from before, the voice I had heard earlier, filled the room. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, now clearer, closer. I turned and ran, my feet stumbling over the uneven floor, my breath caught in my throat. The elevator doors were waiting for me, the bright light in the hallway pulling me back. I pressed the button to return to my floor, and as the doors closed behind me, I saw the figure in the chair, staring at me from the shadows. I woke up the next morning in my hotel room, drenched in sweat. It felt like I had been awake for hours. But the clock said it was only 7 a.m. I checked my phone. The elevator button still glowed in my mind. But when I tried to search for the hotel on my phone, the map didn't show it. The building I was staying in didn't exist on any map. End quote. Neither did the basement. I didn't expect anything unusual from this trip. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway, a chance to clear my head after a stressful few months at work. I booked a room at a small, secluded hotel in the mountains. Far enough from the city to escape the noise, but close enough to be convenient. Pit. The pictures on the hotel's website showed a quaint little place, surrounded by trees, with a cozy fireplace and warm lighting. It was exactly what I needed. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just somewhere to relax and recharge. When Ty arrived, the place seemed almost too quiet. The air was crisp, clean, and the mountains loomed just beyond the property, shrouded in mist. The hotel itself looked older than I expected, a little worn around the edges, but not in a way that made me nervous. Q. The receptionist, an older man with thick glasses, greeted me with a quiet smile and handed me a key. Room 370, he said, his voice soft but steady. Enjoy your stay. It's a very peaceful place here. I smiled politely and thanked him, taking the key. It was a small thing, but there was something strange about it, like the numbers on the card had been scratched off and replaced with marker. Room 303. I didn't think much of it at the time. The hallways were dimly lit, and the hotel had that faint, dusty smell of a building that had been around for a while. The carpet was worn, and the wallpaper had faded in places, but nothing that screamed danger or anything like that. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled on the plush carpet, until I found room 303. I slid the keycard into the door's lock, and it clicked open. What I saw inside made me freeze. The room looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of a renovation. The wallpaper was peeling in huge strips, and the furniture was a mess, as though someone had tried to clear it out hastily. The bed was covered in dust, the sheets yellowed, and there was a strange, charred smell lingering in the air. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath me, and looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. A sudden chill swept through the room, and my heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong here, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The room had this eerie, unfinished feeling to it, like it had been abandoned in the middle of some catastrophic event. The walls weren't just weathered, they were scorched in places. The wood panels warped and blackened like they'd been burned. I rubbed my eyes, trying to dismiss it. It couldn't be possible. How could I have gotten a room like this? I checked the keycard again, room 303, the same room number I'd been given. But this wasn't a place anyone was supposed to stay in. I stepped back out into the hallway and went to the front desk, my pulse quickening. The receptionist was still there, sitting at his desk, looking at something on his computer. I cleared my throat, and he looked up at me, his expression as calm as ever. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, his voice polite, but neutral. "Room 303, I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "The room, something's wrong with it. It looks like it was burned." The man didn't react at first. He just stared at me for a moment, his glasses glinting in the light. And then, without any emotion, he spoke. 303, he repeated, as though confirming something in his mind. "That room's been closed for repairs. It was damaged in a fire." I felt my stomach drop. "A fire, Ty?" "Yes," he said, as though it was common knowledge. "It happened a few months ago. We're still fixing it up." "But I was just given the key for that room," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just opened it. It's in terrible condition. There's smoke damage, charred walls, and the furniture is destroyed. I'm not sure how room 303... He interrupted me, looking slightly confused. "Sir, that room's been out of commission for quite a while now. It's not available for guests." "Are you sure you're in the right room?" I could feel the unease spreading through me. I didn't understand what was happening. "I've got the key right here," I said, pulling it from my pocket and handing it to him. "Room 303. The receptionist took the key from my hand and glanced at it for a moment. Then, without saying anything, he walked out from behind the desk and headed toward a back room. I stood there, my mind racing, unsure of what to do next. Was he just going to ignore me, pretend nothing was wrong? A few minutes later, the man returned with a different keycard in his hand, but his expression had changed. He seemed more serious now, as if something had shifted in him. He handed me the new keycard and spoke, his tone now much more deliberate. "Sir," he said, "I apologize for the confusion. The room you were assigned was indeed not supposed to be in use. I'll make sure you're moved to a proper room immediately. I'll call someone to assist you with your luggage." I was confused and frustrated. "But what about room 303? What's going on with it? Why is it still listed? If it's been damaged in a fire." The receptionist didn't meet my eyes as he answered, "Dad, there's no need to worry about that, sir. Please, take this key. I'll make sure everything is handled on my end." I took the new keycard, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The receptionist had grown distant, his demeanor shifting. I left the front desk without saying anything more, but my mind was spinning. I found another room on the second floor, one that seemed perfectly normal, clean, well kept. Nothing like room 303. I put my bags down, sat on the bed, and tried to calm myself, but something nagged at me. The hotel had been too quiet, the situation too strange. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to room 303. I'd been given that key for a reason. I had seen it with my own eyes, smelled the burnt wood, touched the scorched furniture. Around 2 a.m., I found myself standing at the window, staring out into the night. I don't know what made me do it, but I felt drawn back to the area near the elevator. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't resist. I needed to know more. I stepped out of the room and made my way back to the elevator. It was quiet. The hallway was empty. I got off at the third floor, and stood before the door to room 303. The door looked perfectly fine now. The sign on it reading room 3030C, 30C. I stood there, my hand hovering over the door handle, knowing full well that the room was supposed to be closed. But there I was, compelled to turn the handle. I opened the door. The room was exactly as it had been before, burnt, charred, and abandoned. The smell of smoke hung in the air like an old memory, but there was one thing that hadn't been there before: a single, blackened piece of paper. It was folded neatly on the floor beside the bed, as though it had been placed there just for me to find. I bent down, my hands shaking, and unfolded the paper. Q. The words were barely legible, scorched in places, but I could make out the message. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. You don't belong here. I didn't wait. I didn't even think. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway felt even colder now, as though the walls themselves had been pulled into the room. I rushed back to my new room, my breath ragged, and locked the door behind me. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that whatever was in that room is still here, lingering. The hotel is perfectly normal again, but I can't stop thinking about the fire that supposedly happened, about the key, and about the note that was waiting for me. And I keep asking myself the same question. Asterisk, why was I given the key to a room that was supposed to be burned down? The more I try to forget, the more I wonder if I was the one meant to burn. I was never one to believe in anything paranormal. I've always considered myself a practical person, someone who trusts logic and reason above all else. But there's one experience that I can't explain, and it's haunted me since the day it happened. The day I saw my own name written in the morgue log. It started innocuously enough. I'm a coroner at St. Augustine Medical Center, a position I'd held for just over 3 years. I'd grown used to the sights and sounds of the morgue, the cold, sterile environment that accompanied the job. It's a quiet place, a place of solitude, soot. I'd always prided myself on my professionalism, the way I could separate myself from the emotions that come with the job. After all, I was there to perform a service, to identify, to examine, and to determine the cause of death. That day, I arrived at work as usual, just before 7 a.m. The early hours of the morning still shrouded in the hazy fog of the previous night's rain. The hospital was quiet, most of the staff had already arrived, but the building hadn't yet come to life. I made my way to the morgue, unlocked the heavy steel doors, and stepped inside. The chill of the room hit me immediately, a stark contrast to the warmth of the rest of the hospital. The faint hum of the ventilation system filled the silence. I was greeted by one of the technicians, a man named Simon, who handed me a folder. "We've got 3 new bodies today," he said. 2 from the ER, 1 from the street. The one from the street's a John Doe. The others have IDs, but the causes of death are a bit unclear. I nodded and took the folder, flipping through. The preliminary reports. Nothing out of the ordinary. The first case was a middle-aged man who'd died of a heart attack. The second, a woman in her early 30s who had suffered a severe brain hemorrhage. Both cases seemed straightforward enough. Then, I came to the John Doe. The man was found in an alley late at night. No identification, no belongings, just a body that had been abandoned. The preliminary report listed a cause of death as undetermined, but the body showed signs of trauma: bruises, cuts, abrasions, though nothing that would suggest a violent crime. The report was vague, leaving me with more questions than answers. I sighed, setting the folder aside for later examination. But as I did, something caught my eye. The morgue log was open on the desk in front of me. The log is where we keep track, of every body that comes through the morgue, from the time it's received to when the autopsy is completed. It's routine, necessary, and something I always keep up to date. As I glanced over the entries, I noticed something odd. There, near the top of the list, was my name. Jondo Sechi Ikinzi AM. Cause of death: undetermined, autopsy pending. I frowned, confusion washing over me. My name. But that wasn't right. I hadn't been listed in the log for anything. It was a mistake. A simple error. I was sure of it. But it didn't make sense. The log was usually printed and typed. It wasn't handwritten. But this entry was written in pencil. Something that seemed out of place given the other neatly typed entries. Kush. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the words, trying to make sense of it. It had to be a mistake, a mix-up. But something inside me told me to keep looking. I flipped back through the log, scanning the other entries from the past few days. Every one of them was typed correctly. No mistakes, no handwritten notes, except for this one. The one with my name. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. It had to be some sort of joke, maybe someone messing around. I laughed nervously to myself. But then the thought hit me: why would anyone write my name in the log? I stepped back from the desk, my heart starting to race, but I didn't have time to think it through. I had work to do. I had to get started on the autopsies. The morning passed in a blur. I went through the cases, starting with the John Doe. I felt uneasy, distracted, but I tried to focus. I had to finish. I opened the cooler where his body was stored, lifting the white sheet from his face. The man was in his mid-40s, with dark hair and a rough, weathered face, the kind of person you might see walking the streets at night. His body had the usual signs of a man who had been in the elements for a while. I set to work, but as I began the incision, I noticed something strange. A small, faint tattoo on his inner forearm. It was a symbol, something I didn't recognize, at first. It looked like a spiral, a series of concentric circles, etched into the skin in dark ink. I leaned in closer, my curiosity piqued. Tattoos weren't uncommon in the morgue, but this one seemed different, somehow more deliberate. I continued. I felt a growing sense of dread. The tattoo was somehow familiar. I couldn't place it, but it made my stomach twist. I tried to push the feeling aside, focusing on the task at hand. But then, something else happened. As I finished the incision and began examining the internal organs, something moved. It was small, just a twitch at first, almost imperceptible. But it was enough to make me stop. I stepped back, my gloves covered in the man's blood, my heart pounding. Was I imagining things? Then, the body moved again. The fingers twitched, just slightly, almost as if responding to my touch. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This was impossible. The man had been dead for hours. Q was cold. Rigor mortis had already set in. Bodies didn't move after death, not like this. But the movement didn't stop. The fingers twitched again, and then the whole hand jerked, as if trying to grab at something. I stepped back from the table, my mind racing, panic clawing at my chest. I couldn't think straight. My body felt numb, my hands trembling. And then, the worst part, I heard a voice. It was faint, a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Asterisk, help me. I turned around, scanning the room, but there was no one there. Just me, the body, and the growing sense of dread that gripped me. The voice came again, louder this time. Asterisk, help me. I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed, my feet glued to the floor as the voice echoed in my mind. I looked down at the John Doe's face, expecting to see some sign that this was a hallucination, some proof that I was losing my mind. But instead, I saw something worse. The man's eyes were open. Not all the way, but enough for me to see them dark, glassy, and staring right at me. My heart raced, and I stumbled back, my legs shaking. The room spun around me. The man's eyes were locked on me now. No longer empty, but filled with something darker, something alive. I rushed to the phone, dialing the front desk, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the receiver. "There's something wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "I need help. Call someone. Call security. Call anyone. There's something in the morgue." But before I could say another word, I heard a soft click behind me. I turned, and the body was gone. There was no sign of it. No blood, no remnants, nothing. The morgue was empty. I don't know what happened next. The rest of the day was a blur. I was sent home, told to take the rest of the day off. But I can't forget what I saw, the movement, the whispering, the eyes. I've tried to rationalize it, but I can't. The next time I checked the morgue log, my name was there again. This time, written in red ink. Asterisk, John Doe, 5:22 a.m. Cause of death, undetermined, autopsy pending, body missing. I don't know what happened to the man, to the body, or to me. But I do know this. Something in that morgue is waiting for me. And it's not the body. See, I've been a forensic investigator for 5 years, long enough to have seen some of the most unsettling cases, the ones that keep you awake at night, replaying the grisly details in your mind. But nothing could have prepared me for the case. That started 2 weeks ago. It began with a routine call. A body had been found in an old, run-down warehouse on the edge of town. The kind of place where you'd expect to find drug deals or stolen goods, not a murder. The victim was a young woman, no ID, just a small wallet with a few bills and a bus pass. Her face was bruised, but there was no obvious sign of struggle. No blood, no signs of violent force. Just the stillness of death, a single unbroken figure lying on the cold, cracked concrete floor. It was an odd scene, but nothing I hadn't seen before. I started the usual process: photographs, notes, measurements. The body was positioned in a way that didn't make sense: legs splayed, arms outstretched, hands open like she was waiting for something. But there was nothing else about her that stood out. Nothing that screamed for attention. Except one thing. She wasn't wearing gloves. It was strange, because the environment was cold, and the warehouse, though abandoned, had been exposed to the elements. Her hands should have been covered to protect against the chill, but instead, they were bare, almost unnaturally smooth. I had thought it was a minor detail at first, but as I started to process the scene, the oddness of it became clear. I checked the victim's hands for fingerprints, something we always do as part of the standard procedure. There were none. No prints at all. That's when the unease started to creep in. I ran the prints through the system, double-checking for any matches. Nothing completely clean. No sign that these hands had ever touched anything in their life. Not the ground, not a door handle, not a single object. The rest of the body was in the same condition. Smooth, almost too smooth, as if her skin had never been exposed to anything more than air. My mind raced. Could someone have wiped her prints clean? It was possible, but I'd never seen a case quite like this. I had to know more. I examined her wrists for any signs of restraints, but found nothing. She wasn't tied up. She wasn't held. It was as if she had just been there, sitting on the floor, waiting. I returned to the scene to recheck everything. The warehouse was empty, save for the scattered remnants of junk that had collected over the years. Old chairs, broken crates, a few discarded bottles. Nothing out of place. But as I made my way to the back of the building, I noticed something unusual in the corner. A small, dark smear on the wall near the floor, like someone had brushed against it, leaving a faint trace of something. I crouched down, my flashlight illuminating the area, and my heart skipped a beat. There, smeared along the wall, was a handprint. Not just any handprint, though it was more of a faint impression. Almost as if someone had tried to press their hand into the wall, but hadn't quite made contact. I ran my fingers over the print. The skin felt smooth, as if it were still fresh, but it wasn't just the print itself that caught my attention, it was the fact that it didn't belong to the victim. The print was too large, the fingers too long. The palm was broader. This handprint wasn't human. I stood up quickly, my breath shallow, my skin prickling. I scanned the room once more, convinced I was missing something. But there was no one else in the warehouse, no signs of anyone else being there. And yet, there was the print, the unmistakable impression of something or someone else. When I got back to the lab, I ran the print through every possible database. Nothing came up. I couldn't make sense of it. The handprint didn't match anything I'd ever seen before, not in any system I had access to. It was as if it had never existed. But the strangest part of all was that the handprint was faint, as if it were barely there, just a whisper of an impression. I reviewed the victim's body one more time, convinced I'd missed something, some clue that would explain everything, and that's when I saw it. There was a faint indentation on her wrist, like a mark from something that had been pressed into her skin. I checked the rest of her arms, her neck, the same faint marks, like something had been applied, but too lightly to leave a clear impression. My mind was racing now. What could cause that? I remembered the missing gloves, the smoothness, of her skin, the lack of fingerprints, and it hit me. She had been exposed to something, not a human. not a normal person. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been touched by something unnatural. Days passed as I continued my investigation, trying to piece together the puzzle. But every clue led to more questions, and the deeper I dug, the more I began to suspect that this wasn't just a case of a random death. This was something deliberate. Someone had left her here, someone or something who didn't leave a trace. Then, 2 days ago, as I was reviewing the security footage from the warehouse, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to see that a figure had entered the warehouse around the time of the victim's death. The figure was tall, too tall to be human, and its movements were unnatural. It seemed to glide across the floor, almost as if it wasn't walking at all. As it moved, the victim, who was already in the room, sitting motionless, turned, her head slowly toward it, her eyes wide open. The figure stopped in front of her. Then, it reached out, almost tenderly, and placed its hand on her bare skin. I froze. My stomach twisted. It didn't make sense. The footage was too disturbing, too surreal to comprehend, but I could see the imprint, clearly the handprint left on her skin, right where the figure had touched her. I leaned forward, my pulse racing, as the figure withdrew its hand. The victim didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She didn't do anything. She just sat there, as if she were waiting for the touch, for the imprint, and then the figure disappeared. I stared at the screen, my mind screaming for answers I couldn't find. The next morning, I went to the morgue to check on the victim, Kay. Again, I had hoped for some clue, something that might make sense of what I had seen, but when I arrived, something was different. The body was gone. There were no records, no notes, no trace of her in the morgue log. I felt like I was losing my grip. What had I seen? Who or what had touched her? What did that handprint mean? I don't know what's going on anymore, but I can't ignore it. The handprint, the victim, the figure, none of it makes sense. And now, there's a part of me that wonders if I'm being watched, because I'm starting to see the same faint handprint on the walls of the hospital, on my desk, on the doors, and I can't seem to shake the feeling that it is still here, still waiting. 2. I've been working at St. Charles Hospital for nearly a year now. It's a big hospital, the kind that's been around for decades, with long hallways, old wood paneling, and the unmistakable scent of antiseptic that lingers in the air no matter how many air fresheners you use. I'm a night nurse in the pediatric ward, where it's usually quiet after midnight, save for the occasional beep of a monitor or the soft shuffle of nurses on their rounds. It's peaceful, mostly, but there's one room in the hospital I've learned to avoid, room 104. It's not even the room itself that unsettles me. It's what happens when I walk past it. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. The lights flickered. No big deal, right? Electrical issues happen in old buildings like this all the time. But after a while, it started happening every single time I walked past room 14. The lights above the hallway, the ones that run in rows down the ceiling, would flicker just once, and then return to their steady glow. But it was enough to make me stop in my tracks each time, the sudden dimming and brightening making my stomach drop. It didn't feel like a normal flicker. It felt deliberate. like something was making the lights dance in the shadows as I passed. I mentioned it to a few of my colleagues, but they all brushed it off. Old wiring, they'd say, or it's just the ghosts of the hospital. Everyone says the lights flicker in that hall. But they didn't seem to take it seriously, and after a while, I tried not to either. I focused on my patients, the kids in my care, and told myself it was nothing more than a quirk of the building. But then, it happened again. This time, in the middle of my shift. It was just after 2 a.m., and I had gone to check on a young boy named Max, who was recovering from surgery. His room was just down the hall from room 104. I was walking back to the nurse's station. When it happened, those damn lights flickered. This time more violently than I'd ever seen. I froze, looking up at the ceiling, but it wasn't just the hallway lights that were affected. The overhead lights in the rooms seemed to flicker too, the dim glow spilling out from under the door. Room 104. It was like the room itself was pulsing with some kind of energy. My heart thudded in my chest as I stood there, staring at the door. The sound of the hospital was muted, the normal background hum of machines and murmurs from nurses suddenly quiet. The hallway felt unnaturally still, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift whenever I looked away. For a moment, I thought I saw movement behind the glass window of the door, a shadow moving across the walls. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, my feet dragging. I shouldn't have done it. I know that now, but curiosity got the best of me. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the doorknob. The moment I touched it, the lights flickered. Again, this time a full, rhythmic pulse that almost felt like it was breathing. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. Something held me back, like a pull in my chest that screamed to leave it alone. Instead, I stepped back, my breath quick, and shallow. The flickering stopped, and the hallway fell silent once more, as if nothing had ever happened. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before I finally turned away. I tried to shake it off, tried to forget about it. I went on with my shift, checked on my patients, and helped the doctors with their rounds. But the flickering light coat wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I passed room 104, I could feel my pulse race. I was hyper-aware of the overhead lights, waiting for the next time they would flicker, as if they were waiting for me to notice them. The next night, the same thing happened. I was walking down the hall at 3 a.m. when I noticed it again. The flickering lights. But this time, something else happened. A whisper, soft, like a breath against my ear. Coming from the direction of room 104, I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. The hallway was still empty. No one was around. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was nothing. The whispering stopped as soon as it had started, leaving me standing there, completely still, my skin crawling. The flickering lights were more pronounced now, flashing in time with my quickening heartbeat. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned to face room 104. The door was ajar, just slightly, the gap narrow, but enough for me to catch a glimpse of the empty bed inside. There was no patient. There was no one in the room at all. Yet, the lights were flickering, casting shadows across the sterile white walls. The whispering began again, just faintly, barely audible. It sounded like a voice calling my name, Emma. I could hear it clearly now, as though someone were standing right next to me, whispering in my ear. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I wanted to turn and run, but something kept me frozen. I couldn't stop looking at that door. The shadows behind it seemed to shift, almost as if something was moving inside, but there was no one there, no one that I could see. I stepped closer, reaching for the door, compelled by some force I couldn't explain. As my fingers touched the cold metal of the knob again, the lights flickered wildly. The whispering grew louder, and then I felt it. A cold gust of air rushed past me, coming from inside the room. I could feel it on the back of my neck, a chill that made my skin break out in goosebumps. I couldn't breathe. One had to get out of there. I yanked the door shut and turned away, running down the hall toward the nurse's station. My head was spinning, my breath ragged. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew I wasn't going back to that hallway again, not alone, at least. The next morning, I decided to ask the head nurse about room 104. I knew I'd have to be careful, but I had to know. I approached her during our break, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. "Is there anything unusual about room 104? I asked, keeping my tone casual. The nurse looked at me, her expression unreadable. She paused for a moment before responding. "Room 104. It's been closed for years. The last patient who stayed there died under strange circumstances. See, no one ever goes in there anymore." "Strange circumstances?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The nurse didn't elaborate. She just shook her head and walked away, sighed. I never went near room 104 again. I don't know if I ever will. But every time I pass that hallway, I can't help but feel that pull, that sense of something lingering just beyond the door. The lights still flicker when I walk by, but I no longer stop to look. I don't know what's waiting in room 104, but I can't bring myself to go back to find out. There's something that's not ready to let go, and it whispers my name every night.